The evening was quiet, the sort of silence Daniel had grown used to in his small apartment.
He sat hunched over his desk, working late into the night, the glow of his desk lamp casting warm shadows over his scattered sketches and unfinished designs. Among the clutter was an old photo of Daniel with his father, a memory of simpler times.
He paused for a moment, looking at the photograph, feeling the familiar pang of loss that always seemed to surface late at night. It had only been 6 months since his father's passing, but the wound felt fresh. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound was unexpected, breaking the solitude of the evening. Daniel frowned, glancing at the clock.
It was well past visiting hours for anyone he knew.
He set down his pencil and cautiously made his way to the door, each step bringing a sense of unease. He peered through the peephole to see an unfamiliar face, a middle-aged man, his face lined and wary, yet his posture somehow confident.
Daniel hesitated before finally turning the lock. He cracked the door open slightly, his voice guarded. "Yes?"
The stranger smiled, though it barely reached his eyes.
"Are you Daniel Harper?"
he asked, his voice carrying an almost nostalgic warmth.
Daniel nodded slowly.
"Who's asking? I'm Arthur," the man said.
"An old friend of your father's."
For a moment, Daniel was unsure how to respond. His father rarely spoke about friends, especially anyone named Arthur. His curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the door wider. "You?"
"Knew my father?" Arthur nodded, his gaze softening. "May I come in?"
"It's a long story."
Daniel hesitated, but finally stepped aside, gesturing for Arthur to enter.
The stranger moved past him, his eyes immediately scanning the apartment, lingering on the old photos of Daniel's parents hung along the walls. Arthur made his way to the one couch and took a seat, settling in as if he belonged there. Daniel stood by the door for a moment, watching him. "You said you knew my father," he finally said, moving towards the living room, his voice edged with skepticism.
"He never mentioned you." Arthur smiled again, this time with a tinge of sadness.
"No, I imagine he wouldn't have. Your father and I.
We had our differences."
He looked at the photographs, as if they held a piece of a story he wasn't ready to share in full.
"But we were close once, closer than brothers." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly.
The man in front of him spoke with an earnestness that was disarming, yet there was an undercurrent of something unspoken.
Daniel couldn't decide if it was sincerity or something darker.
"Like brothers?"
he repeated. "My dad never mentioned having close friends, let alone someone like you." Arthur sighed, reaching into his coat pocket. "I know this is all sudden, but I thought it was time you knew about your father's past."
The parts he never talked about. He pulled out a faded, creased photograph and held it out for Daniel to take. Daniel stepped forward and took the picture from Arthur's hand. It was a snapshot of two young men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling broadly at the camera. One of them was unmistakably his father, much younger, his eyes full of a carefree joy that Daniel had rarely seen in his adult life. The other man, standing beside him, was Arthur. Daniel stared at the photograph, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite place.
He had idolized his father, thought of him as a simple, honest man who had sacrificed so much for his family. Yet here was a glimpse of another side, one that was adventurous, perhaps even reckless. It made him wonder what else he didn't know. Arthur leaned back on the couch, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "Your father was more than the man you knew, Daniel. He lived a life full of risks and secrets. Things he never told anyone, especially you."
Daniel lowered the photograph, his voice barely above a whisper.
Why are you here now?
What do you want from me?
Arthur's expression grew somber. I don't want anything from you. I came because there are things you deserve to know. Stories that your father would never share, but stories that are important to understand who he truly was.
Daniel glanced at the photograph again, feeling a strange mix of yearning and fear. Part of him wanted to tell Arthur to leave, to hold on to the memory of his father that he had always cherished.
But another part of him, a part that had been restless since his father's death, wanted to hear more.
He wanted to know the man in the photograph, the one who looked so different from the father who had raised him.
All right, Daniel said, his voice firmer now.
You can tell me. But if I feel like you're lying, or if this is some kind of trick, Arthur held up his hand. I understand. All I ask is that you listen. And if, at the end, you want nothing to do with me, I'll leave.
Daniel nodded slowly and sat down across from Arthur, the photograph still in his hand.
He couldn't deny the curiosity that had taken hold of him, the desire to uncover the truth behind the stories that Arthur seemed so eager to tell.
Arthur smiled, but this time it was tinged with sadness. It all began long before you were born, he said.
Your father and I were like two sides of the same coin.
We grew up together, got into trouble together.
But there was one adventure, one choice, that changed everything for us. He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting Daniel's gaze again. Your father made sacrifices, Daniel, for you, for your family. And he kept those sacrifices hidden because he thought it was the best way to protect you.
Daniel felt a knot form in his throat. He had always known his father to be a man of few words when it came to the past. But now, as Arthur spoke, he realized just how much he had been shielded from. The image of his father as an unassuming, steady presence was beginning to fracture, replaced by something far more complicated.
Arthur rose from the couch, glancing towards the door. I know this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to believe everything right away. But I am staying at a motel just down the road. If you want to know more, if you want to understand the truth, come find me tomorrow.
There are things I need to show you. Daniel watched as Arthur moved towards the door, feeling torn.
He had spent years idolizing his father, holding on to the belief that he was a hero in every sense of the word. But Arthur's words had planted a seed of doubt, and with it came the gnawing need to know more. Arthur paused at the door, looking back at Daniel. I hope you'll come, Daniel.
There's still so much left unsaid.
With that, he was gone, leaving Daniel alone in the quiet apartment. He stared at the photograph in his hand, the smiling faces of his father and Arthur staring back at him. Questions swirled in his mind, each one more troubling than the last. Who was his father, really? What secrets had he kept, and why had he kept them hidden? Daniel knew he wouldn't be able to sleep that night.
He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, the foundation of everything he believed about his family suddenly unstable.
He stood by the window, looking out at the darkened street, and he knew that he had no choice but to follow this thread to its end, wherever it might lead. The next day, he would go to Arthur's motel. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The following morning, Daniel found himself driving to the address Arthur had given him, his mind tangled in a web of thoughts and emotions. The sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the streets, but the brightness seemed to contrast with the unease weighing on him. He had spent most of the night thinking about Arthur's visit, the photograph, and the stories that lay untold. The promise of discovering a different side of his father had pulled him in, and though his instincts told him to tread carefully, the pull of curiosity was too strong. The motel where Arthur was staying was run down, a relic of a past era with peeling paint and a sign that flickered on and off. Daniel parked his car and hesitated for a moment, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel.
He glanced at the faded curtains in the windows, wondering if he should really be here.
But the questions that Arthur had stirred within him refused to be ignored.
He took a deep breath, stepping out of the car, and made his way to Arthur's room, knocking on the door twice, firmly but with a hint of hesitation. The door opened, and Arthur greeted him with a tired but welcoming smile.
"You came," Arthur said, stepping aside to let Daniel in. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old tobacco. It was sparsely furnished: a small bed, a table cluttered with papers and photographs, and a suitcase that seemed like it had seen too many travels. Daniel entered, feeling out of place, and looked around, his eyes drawn to the items scattered across the table.
"I had to come," he replied.
"I need to understand what you were talking about last night."
Arthur nodded and gestured to a chair by the table.
"Please sit. There's a lot I need to show you."
He moved to the table and picked up an old wooden box. It looked weathered, the edges worn, as though it had been handled countless times over the years.
Arthur opened the box slowly, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and small trinkets.
He took out a photograph and handed it to Daniel.
It showed Arthur and Daniel's father, both much younger, standing in front of an old car.
They looked happy, carefree, as if the world had been theirs to conquer.
"Your father and I, we had a life together that no one knew about."
"He wanted to protect you from it, to keep you away from everything that happened back then," Arthur said, his voice laced with nostalgia.
Daniel studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the man he saw with the father he had known. "Why didn't he ever mention you?"
Daniel asked, the frustration evident in his voice.
"Why keep you a secret from me?"
Arthur sighed deeply, his gaze falling to the items in the box.
He pulled out a letter, the paper yellowed with age. "Because there were things your father regretted, choices he made that he thought were best for you."
"But those choices had consequences."
"I was one of those consequences."
He handed the letter to Daniel. Daniel took it, his eyes scanning the words written in his father's handwriting. It spoke of sacrifices, of decisions made to protect family, and of a rift that grew between the two brothers' decisions that had led to Arthur's estrangement. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his chest as he read, the words blurring slightly as he tried to process them.
His father had always been a man of few words, especially when it came to his past, and now he was beginning to understand why. There was so much more than he had ever imagined, so many layers hidden beneath the surface.
Arthur watched Daniel's reaction, his expression somber.
"He kept me away because he believed it was for your own good."
"But I came back because I think you deserve to know the truth, all of it."
"And I believe it's time we face the past together."
Daniel looked up, meeting Arthur's gaze.
There was a sincerity in his uncle's eyes that made it hard to doubt him, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside. "Where do we start?" Daniel asked, his voice steadier now, though his heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation.
Arthur smiled faintly and nodded towards the door.
"There's a place we need to go somewhere your father and I spent a lot of time. It's where many of our secrets are buried. It's the family cabin, out in the woods. I think it'll help you understand who he really was."
Daniel hesitated. The thought of venturing out to some isolated place with a man he barely knew weighing heavily on him.
But there was something about the way Arthur spoke, the gravity in his voice, that told him this was important.
He nodded, standing up. "All right."
Let's go. The drive to the cabin was long, the roads winding as they left the city behind and headed into the more secluded parts of the countryside.
Arthur directed Daniel through a series of back roads, the trees growing thicker as they drove further into the woods.
The silence between them was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Daniel found himself glancing at Arthur occasionally, trying to read the man beside him, but Arthur's expression remained unreadable, focused on the road ahead.
Eventually, they pulled up to a small clearing, and Daniel could see the cabin just beyond the trees. It was small, rustic, the wood weathered by years of exposure to the elements. It looked as though it hadn't been used in years, the air of neglect giving it an almost haunted feel. Arthur stepped out of the car and gestured for Daniel to follow.
"This was our getaway," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth.
"When things got tough, this was where we'd come. It's where your father felt most like himself." They approached the cabin, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. Arthur pushed open the door, revealing the dusty interior, an old stone fireplace, a few pieces of mismatched furniture, and a table covered in dust. Arthur moved to a small cabinet, opening it and pulling out an old journal. He handed it to Daniel.
"This was your father's," he said simply.
Daniel took the journal, his fingers brushing over the worn cover.
He opened it, the pages filled with his father's neat handwriting, entries that spoke of adventures, regrets, and fears.
He read about road trips they had taken, about the thrill of taking risks, and about choices that led to the fracture between the brothers.
The more he read, the more he realized how little he had truly known about his father.
Arthur watched as Daniel read, his expression pained.
"Your father was a good man, Daniel."
He did what he thought was right, even if it meant losing people he cared about.
"He made sacrifices for you, and he kept those sacrifices hidden because he wanted you to have a better life." Daniel closed the journal, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He looked at Arthur, his voice cracking. "Why now? Why are you telling me all this now, after all these years?" Arthur stepped closer, his eyes filled with remorse.
"Because I couldn't let it end this way.
Your father and I, we never got the chance to make things right. But maybe, just maybe, you and I can.
Maybe we can heal what was broken." Daniel felt the weight of his father's life pressing down on him, the secrets, the sacrifices, the choices that had been made without his knowledge. He took a deep breath, the air heavy with dust and memories.
He looked at Arthur, the man who had been a stranger to him just a day ago, but now felt like a missing piece of his own history.
"What do we do now?"
Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Arthur smiled, a sad but hopeful expression crossing his face. "We keep going."
"There's still more you need to know, more places we need to visit."
"The truth is out there, Daniel, and together, we're going to find it."
Daniel nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead or what other truths would come to light, but he knew one thing: he was ready to face it, to uncover the past and finally understand who his father truly was.
With Arthur by his side, he felt a strange sense of connection, as if the pieces of his life were slowly coming together, revealing a picture he had never thought to see. And so they left the cabin, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing.
Daniel knew that this was just the beginning, that there were still more secrets to uncover, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. ready to face whatever lay ahead, ready to confront the past and find the truth that had been hidden for so long.
The old workshop stood at the edge of town, a forgotten relic from another time. Daniel and Arthur arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the rusted tools and dust-covered car parts that filled the space.
The air was thick with the scent of oil and memories, the past seemingly lingering in every corner.
Arthur led the way, his steps steady as if he had been here countless times before, while Daniel hesitated at the entrance, taking in the unfamiliar yet somehow nostalgic setting.
Arthur paused, turning back to Daniel with a small, almost nostalgic smile.
Your father and I spent a lot of time here. This place was like a second home to us when we were young.
He walked over to a dusty workbench, running his fingers along its worn surface. We had big dreams back then. We used to tinker with old cars, build things.
We thought we could take on the world from right here. Daniel followed Arthur further into the workshop, his eyes scanning the room. There were old photographs pinned to the walls, faded images of his father and Arthur, both young, both smiling, their eyes filled with hope and excitement.
Daniel felt a pang of something deep within, an ache for a past he never knew, for a version of his father that had been hidden from him. Arthur motioned for Daniel to come closer. There's something I want to show you. He walked to a corner of the workshop, kneeling down to reveal a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards.
The wood creaked as Arthur pried it open, revealing a small metal box covered in dust. He lifted it out carefully, placing it on the workbench.
The box had an air of secrecy, its surface scratched and dented, as if it had been through much over the years.
Arthur opened the box, and inside were letters, old documents, and a few trinkets that seemed to hold deep personal value.
He handed a stack of letters to Daniel.
These are from your father.
He wrote them during a difficult time.
I think it's time you read them.
Daniel took the letters, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the first one.
The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, neat, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of emotion. As he began to read, Daniel could feel the depth of his father's struggles. The letters spoke of financial troubles, of choices made in desperation, of trust broken between brothers.
They painted a picture of a man burdened by responsibility, who had done what he thought was necessary to protect his family, even if it meant losing the people he loved. Daniel looked up at Arthur, his heart heavy.
Why didn't he ever tell me any of this?
He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arthur sighed, his eyes filled with regret.
Your father was a proud man, Daniel. He didn't want you to see him as anything less than the hero you believed him to be.
He carried these burdens alone because he thought it was the only way to keep you safe, to give you a better life.
Daniel's mind raced. The image of his father, the man he had idolized, all his life shattering and reshaping with every word he read. There was a part of him that felt betrayed, that wanted to be angry for all the secrets, for the years of silence. But there was also a part of him that understood, that saw the sacrifices his father had made out of love. It was a painful realization, but it brought a kind of clarity he hadn't expected. Arthur reached into the box once more, pulling out an old photograph. It was of Daniel's father and Arthur standing in front of the workshop, their arms around each other, smiling as if they had no cares in the world. Arthur handed it to Daniel, his voice soft.
We had our differences, your father and I.
But there was never a day I didn't care about him.
I regret the choices I made, the way things ended between us. I came back because I didn't want you to carry the same regrets. Daniel looked at the photograph, the smiles on their faces so genuine, so full of life.
He swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump that had formed in his throat.
He always spoke of sacrifice, but I never understood what he meant until now, Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. He gave up so much: his dreams, his relationship with you, all to protect me. Arthur nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He loved you more than anything, Daniel. He wanted you to have a life free of the burdens he carried. But the truth has a way of finding its way back, no matter how deeply it's buried.
Silence settled between them, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them.
Daniel looked around the workshop, the remnants of his father's life scattered throughout. The place felt haunted by memories, by the ghosts of what could have been. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself.
"What now?" he asked, looking back at Arthur. Arthur met his gaze, his expression filled with determination.
"There's one more place we need to go. It's where it all began, where everything went wrong between your father and me. It's time you knew the full story." Daniel nodded, a sense of resolution settling over him. He didn't know if he was ready for what lay ahead, but he knew he couldn't turn back now.
The truth was painful, but it was also necessary. It was the only way to heal, to move forward without the shadows of the past looming over him. Together, they left the workshop, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting the world in a golden glow. The air was cool, and Daniel felt a strange sense of calm, as if the weight he had been carrying was beginning to lift, piece by piece. He looked over at Arthur, seeing not just a stranger, but a man who had been part of his father's life, who had shared in his joys and his sorrows, who had made mistakes, but was now trying to make things right.
As they walked to the car, Arthur paused, turning to Daniel. "You have a choice, you know," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to do this.
You can walk away if it's too much."
Daniel shook his head, his resolve firm.
"No," he replied. "I need to see this through, for my father, for you, and for myself.
I need to understand everything, no matter how difficult it might be." Arthur smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "All right then.
Let's finish this."
With that, they got into the car, the road stretching out before them, leading them to the final chapter of their journey. Daniel knew there would be more revelations, more painful truths, but he also knew that facing them was the only way to truly honor his father's memory. He had spent so long idolizing a man he thought was flawless, but now he was beginning to see the real man flawed, complex, but ultimately filled with love.
And that, Daniel realized, was enough. It was more than enough.
The road stretched out before them, winding through the early morning mist. Daniel drove in silence, his mind consumed with everything he had learned so far.
Arthur sat beside him, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. The journey to the family plot felt different from the others. It was heavy, as though they were not just traveling through physical distance, but also navigating the emotional terrain of their family's broken past. There was an unspoken tension between them, a sense that they were heading towards something that could either heal or irrevocably fracture everything.
As they neared their destination, the landscape began to change. The dense woods gave way to open fields, and Daniel could see the old plot of land in the distance overgrown and forgotten, like a remnant of a past no one wanted to remember.
The cabin, barely visible through the brush, stood solemnly, its structure weathered by years of neglect. The sight of it filled Daniel with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Arthur gestured towards an old dirt road.
"Take the path. It'll lead us right to the cabin."
Daniel nodded and turned the wheel,
feeling his heartbeat quicken.
They drove slowly, the car bouncing over uneven terrain until they came to a stop near the cabin. The air was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. They stepped out of the car, and Daniel took in the surroundings. The cabin was small, its roof partially caved in, and vines had begun to claim its walls. It was almost as if the land itself wanted to swallow the place whole, to hide away the secrets it held.
Arthur walked ahead, his movements deliberate, as if each step was a confrontation with his own past.
"Here we are," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. He paused in front of the cabin, taking a deep breath. "This is where it all began,
and where everything fell apart."
Daniel followed Arthur to the door, which creaked loudly as Arthur pushed it open.
The inside of the cabin was dim, the air thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of age. An old table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a few mismatched chairs.
There were papers scattered across it, yellowed and brittle, remnants of a time long past.
Arthur moved to a corner of the room, lifting a small rug to reveal a trapdoor. He glanced at Daniel, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "There's something down here that you need to see," he said, his voice rough with emotion.
He pulled open the trapdoor, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down to a small cellar.
Daniel hesitated for a moment, then nodded, following Arthur down the steps. The cellar was cramped, the ceiling low enough that Daniel had to hunch slightly. Arthur moved to a shelf along the far wall, picking up a dusty old box.
He opened it, revealing photographs, letters, and a small metal key. Arthur handed one of the photographs to Daniel. It was of his father, younger, standing beside a woman Daniel didn't recognize. She was smiling, her arm wrapped around his father's waist.
Daniel felt a pang of confusion and something deeper jealousy, perhaps, or a sense of betrayal.
"Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Arthur sighed, sitting down on an old wooden crate.
"Her name was Margaret," he said. "She was someone your father cared about deeply before your mother. They were together during a time when everything seemed possible, but then
things changed."
Daniel looked at the photograph, trying to reconcile this version of his father with the man he had known. "Why did he never tell me about her?" he asked, his voice cracking. Arthur rubbed his forehead, his eyes filled with regret. "Because their relationship ended badly, Daniel."
"Your father was forced to make choices that drove them apart."
"He never wanted to burden you with that part of his past." Arthur paused, looking down at the key in his hand. "But there's more. The reason I brought you here isn't just about Margaret. It's about what happened between your father and me." Arthur handed the key to Daniel, gesturing towards a small, locked chest at the back of the cellar.
"Open it," he said.
Daniel approached the chest, his hands trembling slightly as he inserted the key and turned it.
The lock clicked, and he lifted the lid. Inside were more letters, stacks of them, and a ledger, its pages filled with numbers and notes.
Daniel picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages.
It was filled with records of transactions, debts, and payments. His father's name was scrawled across several pages, alongside Arthur's. The numbers told a story of financial struggle, of deals made in desperation. Arthur spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your father and I. We got involved in something we shouldn't have.
A business deal that went wrong.
We thought we could handle it, but it spiraled out of control.
We owed money to people who weren't the kind to let things go.
Your father tried to protect me, to take the blame, But I betrayed him.
I took the money and ran, leaving him to deal with the consequences.
Daniel's heart sank as Arthur's words sank in. He could feel the anger rising within him, a burning sense of betrayal that threatened to overwhelm him.
He clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check.
You left him, he whispered, his voice shaking.
You left him to deal with all of this alone? Arthur nodded, his eyes filled with tears.
I was a coward, Daniel.
I thought I could outrun the mess we had made. But your father, he stayed. He faced it all, and he paid the price.
He lost everything because of me.
Daniel turned away, his chest tight with emotion. He walked back up the stairs, needing air, needing space to think.
He stepped outside, the cool breeze hitting his face as he tried to steady his breathing. Arthur followed him, stopping a few feet away, giving him space.
I came back because I couldn't live with the guilt any longer, Arthur said quietly.
Your father deserved better.
And you deserve to know the truth.
Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him.
His father had always been his hero, a man of integrity, of strength.
To learn that his father had been betrayed, had suffered in silence, was almost too much to bear.
But at the same time, there was a part of him that understood.
His father had made sacrifices, not out of weakness, but out of love for his family, for Arthur, even when Arthur had abandoned him. After a long silence, Daniel turned to Arthur, his eyes filled with tears.
I don't know if I can forgive you, he said, his voice trembling. But I need to try.
For my father's sake, for everything he went through, I need to find a way to move forward.
Arthur nodded, his own eyes wet with emotion.
That's all I can ask for, Daniel.
I can't change what I did, but I can try to make things right now.
I want to be part of your life, if you'd let me.
Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly begin to ease.
He looked at Arthur, seeing not just the man who had betrayed his father, but also a man who was trying to make amends, who was seeking redemption.
We'll take it one day at a time, Daniel said. I can't promise anything, but I am willing to try. Arthur smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes.
Thank you, Daniel.
That's more than I deserve.
Together, they stood in the quiet clearing, the past heavy between them, but no longer an insurmountable wall. There was still so much to work through, so many wounds to heal, but for the first time, Daniel felt that they were on the path to something better. A path that, while uncertain, held the promise of understanding, of forgiveness, and perhaps even a new beginning. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the cabin and the surrounding land.
Daniel looked at the cabin, then back at Arthur.
Let's go home, he said.
We have a lot of work to do.
Arthur nodded, and together they walked back to the car, leaving the cabin and its secrets behind. The journey wasn't over, but Daniel knew that they were finally moving in the right direction towards healing, towards understanding, and towards honoring his father's memory in the best way he could. The ride back home was silent, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It felt different now, and understanding had settled between Daniel and Arthur, unspoken but powerful. The journey they had taken together, the truths uncovered, had left them both raw, vulnerable, but also closer to something neither of them could quite name. Daniel glanced at Arthur, who was gazing out the window, his expression softer than it had been since they met. They reached Daniel's apartment as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the streets in a warm, orange glow.
Once inside, Daniel gestured for Arthur to take a seat at the worn-out couch, and he headed to the kitchen to make some tea.
He needed something to ground him, something normal amidst the whirlwind of emotions.
As he poured hot water over the tea leaves, he thought about everything Arthur had told him about his father, about the betrayal, about the courage it took for Arthur to come back and face the truth after all these years.
Daniel walked back to the living room, handing Arthur a steaming mug.
They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea, letting the warmth seep into them.
Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice quiet but steady. I need to know, Arthur. Why did it take you so long to come back?
Arthur sighed, setting his mug on the table. He looked tired, his eyes weary as they met Daniel's. Fear, he admitted.
I was ashamed, Daniel.
I ran because I was scared of what I had done, scared of facing your father. And as the years went on, it only got harder. I thought I could bury it all, but your father...
He was always there, in my thoughts.
I realized that I couldn't live the rest of my life without trying to make things right.
Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. He understood that kind of fear, how easy it was to run from something painful instead of facing it.
I guess it took losing him for you to finally come back, he said, a hint of sadness in his voice. Arthur swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. I wish it hadn't come to that. I wish I'd been brave enough to come sooner, when he was still alive. But I can't change that now.
All I can do is try to be here for you, if you'll let me.
Daniel looked up, meeting Arthur's gaze.
He could see the regret etched in every line of his uncle's face, the genuine desire for redemption.
It was hard to stay angry when he could see how deeply Arthur was hurting too.
I think my dad would want me to try, Daniel said softly.
To try to forgive you, to try to move forward. He always believed in second chances.
Arthur smiled, a bittersweet expression crossing his face. He was always the better man, he said, his voice cracking slightly.
He had a heart bigger than anyone I knew. They sat there for a while longer, the silence between them filled with unspoken words: grief, regret, hope. Arthur reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded letter. He handed it to Daniel, his eyes earnest.
This is something your father wrote before he passed.
I found it among some of his old things. I think he meant for you to have it. Daniel took the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was his father's, neat and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of love and thought. He read silently, his eyes welling up as the words sunk in. My dearest Daniel, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things myself. I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've grown into a man I admire, strong, kind, and resilient. I know I wasn't always open about my past, and I regret that. There are things I should have told you, things I wanted to say, but never found the right time.
Life is full of mistakes, my boy, and I made my share.
But if there's one thing I've never doubted, it's the love I have for you.
No matter what you learn about me, know that everything I did for you. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope you find it in your heart to forgive others too. Be happy, Daniel. Live without the burdens I carried.
Love freely and forgive often.
That's the best way to honor me.
All my love, Dad. Tears rolled down Daniel's cheeks as he finished reading.
He folded the letter carefully, holding it against his chest, feeling the weight of his father's words, the love, the hope, the plea for forgiveness. He looked at Arthur, who was watching him with a mixture of sadness and hope. He forgave you, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion.
He forgave you a long time ago. Arthur's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, his voice breaking as he spoke. I hoped he did. I truly hoped he did. Daniel reached out, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder.
And I think I can too. It's what he would want. It's what I want. Arthur looked at Daniel, a tear escaping down his cheek, and he placed his hand over Daniel's. Thank you, he whispered. You have no idea how much that means to me.
They sat there, two men bound by the memory of someone they both loved deeply, finding a way to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long.
The air felt lighter, as if the weight of the past was finally beginning to lift, replaced by the hope of something new, a chance to rebuild, to create a future that honored the man they had both lost.
Later that evening, they shared a simple meal together.
The conversation was hesitant at first, but slowly it became easier. They talked about Daniel's father, sharing stories, some filled with laughter, others with tears. For the first time, Daniel felt like he was really getting to know his uncle, not just the man who had betrayed his father, but also the man who was trying to make amends, who was trying to be better.
As the night wore on, Daniel realized that forgiveness wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a process, a journey, one he was only beginning.
But he was willing to take that journey, step by step, day by day. He looked at Arthur, who was smiling at a memory he had just shared, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, Daniel woke with a sense of clarity. The events of the past few days had brought so much pain, but they had also brought something else: understanding, closure, and the possibility of a new beginning. He got up, moving to the living room where Arthur was already awake, sipping a cup of coffee.
Arthur, Daniel began, I've been thinking. I want us to visit my father's grave.
Together, I think it's time. Arthur looked at Daniel, his eyes widening slightly, and then he nodded, his expression softening. I'd like that, he said.
I'd like that very much. They packed up what they needed and headed out.
As they drove towards the cemetery, Daniel felt a calmness settle over him.
He knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a long journey of healing.
But he was ready.
He was ready to let go of the anger, the resentment, and embrace the possibility of something better.
When they reached the grave, Daniel stood there for a long time, looking at his father's name etched into the stone.
He placed a hand on the headstone, closing his eyes. I understand now, Dad, he whispered.
I understand why you did what you did.
And I'll do my best to honor you, to live without the burdens you carried. Thank you for everything.
Arthur stood beside him, silent but present, and together they paid their respects. There was still a long road ahead, filled with uncertainties, but in that moment, Daniel knew they were finally on the right path, one that honored the past, but didn't let it define them, one that embraced the future with hope and love. And that, Daniel thought, was exactly what his father would have wanted. Estrangement now, the state of being separated or distant from someone. Explanation, a situation in which people are no longer close or affectionate to each other. Example, the estrangement between Daniel's father and Arthur lasted for many years. Somber ADJ,
dark or dull in color or tone, gloomy.
Explanation, often used to describe a serious or sad mood. Example, Arthur's expression grew somber as he spoke about the past.
Remorse now and a deep regret or guilt for a wrong committed.
Explanation, the feeling of being sorry for doing something wrong or hurtful. Example, Arthur's eyes were filled with remorse for betraying Daniel's father.
Unravel verb to investigate or solve something complicated.
Explanation, to figure out the elements of a difficult or mysterious situation. Example, Daniel wanted to unravel the truth about his father's hidden life.
daunting ADJ,
seeming difficult to deal with in anticipation. Intimidating. Explanation describes something that makes someone feel nervous or afraid because it's challenging. Example: the idea of visiting the cabin was daunting for Daniel.
reconcile verb to restore friendly relations or make peace.
Explanation: to bring together different parties or ideas that were in conflict. Example: Arthur wanted to reconcile with Daniel after years of estrangement. Legacy noun: something handed down from the past as a tradition or heritage. Explanation: anything transmitted from ancestors, such as values or property. Example: Daniel was learning about the true legacy his father left behind. Thank you all for staying with us until the end of The Stranger at the Door.
Did you enjoy the story? I hope it was easy to follow along and that you found the English level comfortable for learning. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you understand the twists in Daniel's journey?
Please let me know in the comments.
Also, don't forget, if you want to keep improving your English comprehension, more stories are just waiting for you on our channel. There will be a suggested video appearing at the end of this one, so click on it and continue your learning journey with us.
Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share more stories with you. Keep practicing and see you soon.